Okay, welcome. Feel free at any time to interrupt me and to ask me some questions. By way of preface, again, I never had the luxury of being a full-time student without working a 40-hour-a-week job. I'm going to teach you what I learned about how to succeed academically. Feel free, again, to ask me any questions that you think are important. I want to begin by bringing two resources to your attention because they are very important. Archive.org and Z Library, or b-ok.cc. And I'm going to take you to those websites now. This is archive.org. You can search by multiple libraries, or, for example, you can search by title. And when you do, it will bring up books which match your selection. My point is that this gives you the opportunity not to go to the library. It gives you the opportunity to widen your research scope and to find resources that can help you get a better sense of what you're working on. Once you find something, you have the ability to download it. If you download it and you use Foxit PDF Reader, you can then annotate it, and we'll be talking about how that works. If I can't find something there, or I'm looking for something more popular, or I'm looking for an article, I can come here. And similarly, I can download any of the works I'm looking for. I can also go to articles that fulfill that requirement. And if necessary, I can do a full text search. These are my primary online resources for anything that I need. Any questions about that before we go back? Okay. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. So I want to start by looking at the ascent of man. And I want to begin to outline in our time together how to approach reading material. This is the ascent of man. I'm going to move this window out of the way. And you can see that this is chapter 1, and I have underlined the first paragraph.
It looks like that window is hidden through WebEx. It's showing a gray box on our screen.
Where? At the bottom?
For my screen, it's just a gray box for the entire screen share.
Okay, I'm not sure why this is shared. Let me try to find out what's going on here. I'll go back to WebEx. Thank you for telling me. You can see that, correct? You can see Microsoft Whiteboard?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Let's just stay here then. I'm not sure what its issue is with Foxit Reader. All right. So let's start out with how to read. And we're going to draw a distinction between a book and an article. I may try one more time to go back and figure out why it's not working. But let's start out with a book first. The first thing that I do is I look at the table of contents. I do that specifically because it gives me a sense of what the logic of the author will be. The second thing I do, if there is a preface and an introduction, I read them. even if they're not required. I do that specifically because it shows me who influenced the author. And oftentimes, if you remember our conversation in class about Darwin, what someone doesn't say, but who someone mentions, is critically important. So in the case of Darwin, references to people like Gregg and Wallace and Tate helped me get a deeper sense of who Darwin was and what Darwin thought about the world. The third step is find the thesis. Let me see if there's another way that I can get it. Fox it. Come on. Okay. All right. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So this is chapter 1 of Lower Than Angels. This is his thesis. Everything that he will say in this chapter will reinforce or argue this point. Am I clear? Everybody got that?
Yes.
Okay. As the article or as the argument unfolds, I'm going to look for important comments. Note that in The Ascent of Man, there are little comments next to important paragraphs. That's a key that I need to pay attention to what's being said here. Note, for example, if we go back to the thesis, man is a singular creature. He has a set of gifts which make him unique among the animals, so that unlike them, he is not a figure in the landscape. He is a shaper of the landscape. In body and mind, he is the explorer of nature, the ubiquitous animal who did not find but has made his home in every environment. Now, based on everything we've talked about in class so far, who does that sound like? Charles Darwin. As we progress through the chapter, the argument will unfold. And by the way, notice my use of color. This outrageous pink is very important, blue, important, and yellow is just worth noting. This becomes the second part of his argument. Man is distinguished from other animals by his imaginative gifts. He makes plans, inventions, new discoveries, etc. So one of the questions I have, let's go back here, as I'm reading the chapter, we now have the thesis, but it's very interesting that he calls this chapter Lower Than Angels. That begs for me to ask, why? And when I understand this, I will understand this. Now, this doesn't mean that every author's title of every chapter is critically important. But in the case of The Ascent of Man, it is. And it will be for two reasons. We've noted the impact of Darwin. You know from class that Darwin wrote a book called The Descent of Man. Bronowski is writing the assent. By definition, everything he's saying presupposes Darwin, but also challenges Darwin's assumptions about the nature of what it means to be human. Are you seeing how I'm working this out? Am I being clear and logical?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking myself then, as I'm reading this chapter, what is Bronowski really saying about Darwin? What is he accepting from Darwin? What is he questioning about what Darwin says? In the meantime, it's important to find the conclusion. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can build it yourself, or you can literally go to the last paragraph of the chapter. And typically, before I even begin to read, not only do I read the preface and the introduction and look at the contents, I will often go to the last page of the book and read it. That gives me a sense of where the author is going. So, in the case of The Ascent of Man, by the time I get to the end of the chapter, we should almost be there. Here we are. By the time we get here, this is his conclusion. Everything from the thesis sentence to here will be designed to substantiate this argument. All over these caves, the print of the hand says, "This is my mark. This is man." Now that I have the introduction, I have the conclusion, I can lay out the argument. And I can do that in one of two ways. As I go, or at the end. I keep several different journals, and we're going to talk about them now and how they relate to this. Is everybody with me so far?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. You don't have to do it the way I've done it. I've been doing this in some shape or form since I was 18. I have a personal journal. And this is where I think about my life. I set my goals. If there are problems in my life that I need to just kind of randomly think about or brainstorm, if I'm working on any poetry or fiction, it all goes here. I have a second journal that are my philosophy notes. I have a third specifically for world religions. So let's take, for example, how would I handle the Ascent of Man, chapter 1, Lower Than Angels. I'm going to open this up. At the top of the page, I put the date. Under the date, I put the topic. And then I just start to write. it doesn't matter whether it makes sense to anyone as long as it makes sense to you. I've become very disciplined. So what I will typically do is in outline fashion, 1, what is the thesis? 2, how does he lay out the argument? What are the important points? 3, what is his conclusion? And 4, do I think it works? Is this clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we should just free write about the topic like in our journal. It doesn't have to, like you'd say, like it doesn't really have to be like structured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are sometimes, for example, you all know that I'm working on eugenics, right? What I do in the case of a topic like, eugenics is call this freestyle. A freestyle journal entry will usually begin, everyone has a date because I need to find it. And organizing by date and then by topic helps me. And for example, I found a quote the other day that was so terribly upsetting to me that I needed to figure out how this person came to the intellectual conclusion that sterilizing someone was actually an act of love. So I wrote the quote. Actually, I copied and pasted it from Phantom Pro. And then I just started to write. This becomes a permanent record. And in a minute, when I talk about how to write a paper, or at some point, you'll see how important this can become. Now, keep in mind, I am totally digital. You don't have to be. Everything I'm teaching you will work if you use paper as well. The key is that anytime you write something, anytime you take the time to sort your thoughts out, you are going to remember it. Otherwise, you're throwing information against the wall, and most of it will disappear. The worst thing you can do is attempt to memorize. The second part of this, which has really helped me far more than I can tell you, humans, regardless of the 3 types of learning, are far more likely to remember something that is visual than they are a concept or an idea. So if you wonder why in class I'm so hell-bent whenever I can about using a diagram, it's because I know we will be more likely to remember it than if I simply make bullet points. So you will find, oftentimes in my journals, diagrams. And they can be as simple as, okay, we know that Darwin was influenced by Malthus. We know that Darwin, even though Spencer wrote before Darwin, we know that Darwin had an impact on Spencer. We know that Spencer, in turn, had an impact on Sumner, Sumner on Keller, and so forth. And in my journal, you will find Spencer, born and died, 1 or 2 sentences about who he was in his life, and somewhere between 4 and 8 sentences that summarize what Spencer wrote. Every time I see Spencer's name, I make that association. I do it for Sumner, I do it for Keller, I do it for Darwin. You see how this begins to work together? It should also help you understand why I can teach without notes in class. Okay, how are you doing so far? Is this helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Yes, Kayla?
Sorry. Do you think that I know I asked this before, but do you think it could help to kind of like have like a separate color coding system for diagrams to like
Absolutely.
to like notes?
Yep, absolutely. Even though I don't see much, if any, color during the daytime, if you could see where I'm sitting now, I'm in a room with absolutely no lights. There is some ambient light from a row of windows, and now I can see enough color. Yes, absolutely. And if we went back through The Ascent of Man and other books that I've outlined, you'll see extensive use of color and color in diagrams, okay? There's one more point I want to make about Foxit and about PDFs in general, and that is the use of bookmarks. These are bookmarks. When you click on a bookmark, it takes you where you need to go. I find that when there is a quote that I want to remember, I not only highlight it, I create a bookmark. I read hundreds of pages a week. Keeping it all straight can be difficult. So when I'm in Foxit, I make extensive use of bookmarks. In some cases, I will start with unfortunately, I'm gonna have to do it this way. In some cases, I will actually start with the table of contents and, for example, the foreword is on page 13. I'll go to page 13, I'll highlight foreword. I will use that then as a bookmark. So theoretically, I can go through a book really quickly, create an entire system of bookmarks for the chapters that's going to help me get where I need to go as quickly as possible. So if you think about what I'm talking about right now, I've touched on this in that paper I sent you, but let's talk about what this means in greater detail. A very important component of this is what I call a default calendar. Most humans are terrible at managing time. The default calendar is critically important for getting a grip and maximizing your effort. I am the consummate free spirit, but I have learned that if I don't practice rigid discipline, I'm going to fail to accomplish anything. I can be distracted by a shadow on a leaf for hours. So let's look at my default calendar. On mornings when I teach, I have to be at A&T by 7:30 a.m. if I want to get a parking space. Typically on those mornings, I get up the time that I prefer to go to bed. This is my time. I make my lunch, I have my breakfast, I organize my day, I do some reading, I make sure I'm prepared for school. From 8 until 10:15, I teach. I travel to the office where I work from 10:45 until 11:45. I prep for my afternoon classes from 11:45 until noon. I break for lunch. From noon until 1, more prep time. If I don't need to prep, then this becomes study time, research time, or writing time. I finish teaching, I start teaching, well, I've got to be at UNCG by 1:30 or I can't get a parking space. 1:30 to 2 is setup time, walk to the classroom and set up. 2 to 4:45, I teach. From 5:15, because it takes me time to walk to my car and drive back to the office, until 6:30, I study and I write. When the quarantine is over, this will change. From 5:15 until 7:30, I will play basketball. I take about 15 minutes, 30 at most, for dinner. And then from basically 8 until midnight, in 1 hour increments, my night is broken up into what I need to accomplish. Every day is this way. The only difference is that on Monday and Thursday, when I don't teach in the morning, I have a different default calendar for the morning. Effectively, this does not give me the opportunity to screw up. If somebody walks in and says, how about a cup of coffee? I already know what my schedule is. I know what I have to accomplish. And typically, less now because my calendar is really pretty ingrained in me. Typically, this is tied to a to-do list. So, for example, if I were a student and not a teacher in my class, as soon as the professor said, or it said in the syllabus, that there would be a quiz every Friday, due at 11:59 on Sunday, that would be added to my to-do list. When I was a student, that to-do list, and it still does to some extent, included a review of my notes. And this is how it worked. Monday through Friday, I read my notes from that day and only that day. On Saturday, I read the week. On Sunday, I read the semester. I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a ton of time. But guess what? The more you do it, the less time it takes. Because part of what happens is that you begin to remember, and you don't need to spend a tremendous amount of time reading every detail. If you cram for a test or a quiz, somewhere around 80% of the information is going to get lost before you take the test. Don't do it. Another reason why I like the use of color as I mentioned, humans are visual. My goal is to make every page of notes An image I can remember. So right now, if I asked you to close your eyes, can you remember the first page of the chapter, Lower Than Angels? In Ascent of Man? I can. And the point is that just in the same way that you can look at a photograph of someone you know and drill down to their left eye or a hair out of place, you can do the same thing here. That's why making every page of notes unique is the key. And just like I do in the PDF, back in the day when I actually wrote, or when I take notes using my pen on my tablet, black is sort of, yep, I just need to know it. Important enough to write it down. Blue ink, that's important. Red ink, that's like serious stuff. Also, if you walked into my study in my home, I have a wall with 60 notebooks, three ring binders, and every one of them is set up exactly the same way. Number one, I have the syllabus from the class. Number two, I have all of my notes from the class. Number three, I have my papers that I wrote. And number four, any photocopies of any articles I had to read. So think about it. Virtually anything that I studied all the way back to my freshman year in college, I can pull that notebook off the shelf and immediately reacquaint myself with any of that information. I still do that. I just do it digitally now. Okay, let me stop there. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I'll give you an example. My study at home, let's see, one, two, yeah, there are books basically on all four walls. Some are wall-to-wall books, others are not. On my laptop, under Documents, I have a folder called eBooks. These are all the PDFs that I use. There are thousands, literally. They're organized by topic. And then they're further organized. For example, general philosophy. I do this, number one, because it helps me discipline my mind. Number two, because it makes it really easy to find stuff. Number three, time is precious. I don't have a lot of time to be looking for something that I didn't put in the right place. In case you haven't figured it out, I work 3 jobs. I have my company. I teach at UNCG, and I teach at A&T. And I'm knee-deep in a book, 350 pages of it. I don't have a lot of time. And the mother of my children, I am a caretaker, has dementia. I don't have a lot of time. If I'm going to succeed, I have to be organized and disciplined. Are there questions so far? Helpful? Yes? No?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. No questions? I keep going?
Yep.
Okay. The phrase is white noise. It's noise in the background that you're not aware of. In some situations, I cannot study in silence. For example, if I'm home, I'm so distractible that I make sure I have some form of white noise in the background. It can be a brainless TV show. It could be, excuse me 1 second, please. Okay, my apologies. My phone is on vibrate. It won't bother us again. Okay, so whatever it is, it's got to be noise that won't distract me. Sometimes it's music. I find that that will settle me down. And that allows me to concentrate. 2, I have an ass-backwards metabolism. That means that caffeine calms me down. I can pretty much guarantee you, especially in another month when it's cool, that every night I'm going to brew myself the same cup of tea in absolutely the same way and put it next to me in exactly the same place. I know that given the amount of stress I have in my life and all the chaos, I need to get calm if I'm going to be effective. So the first thing I do is calm myself down. The third thing I do is make sure that everything is where it needs to be all the time. So while I'm going through the process of making my tea or setting up the white noise, my laptop is where it needs to be. My drawing tablet is where it needs to be. Everything I need is in place. Once I start, I don't want to be interrupted because it takes time to get back to where I was. Fourth, if I have to, I set a timer. You cannot work endlessly. There will come a point where your effectiveness will drop. For my class and for intense reading, this is what I recommend. I still do this slightly differently. More about that in a minute. For me, how to read involves everything that I've just said about calm, about reading in the same place at the same time. I know myself. If I pick up a book and I head to the park and I think I'm going to read, that is just not going to happen. I will be so completely distracted, it will not be possible to focus. The first thing I recommend is that you find out what your attention span is. Find the point at which your concentration breaks down. Right now, given where you are, I would say that I would work in 30-minute intervals. I would read for 20 minutes or study. Break for 10. Now, the break for 10 doesn't mean get up and go crazy or grab a beer or jump on Facebook or whatever social media you think you need to jump on. It means you calm yourself down, you get your focus back. If you need a glass of water, you need to go to the bathroom, just need to stand up, whatever it is, don't go too far. Over time, you will be able to increase this. After 30 minutes, go to 45. Read for 30, break for 15. Stay at 45, read for 35. Break for 10. Stay at 45 and keep whittling down the amount of time that you have to step away. Once you get to 45, work towards an hour. Do not sit down with 200 pages of intense reading and think you're going to do it in one shot. You won't. After 15 to 20 minutes initially, you're going to be shot. Totally unproductive. Don't do it. Which takes me to my next topic. I never submitted, well, once I submitted a paper late because my typewriter was broken. Other than that, every paper in my entire undergraduate career and graduate career was on time. How did I do it? Well, number one, I started with the due date. And at the time, I wrote it on my calendar. Number two, I plotted out the steps required to get my paper done on time. So, for example, let's say that today is the 10th, that I have a paper due on the 24th. By the 11th, I'm going to have my topic, unless the topic is assigned. By the 15th, I'm going to do my research. By the 17th, by the 19th, turn it in on time. This worked flawlessly. You can adjust the times if you need to. For example, if I needed less research, then I would quit on the 14th. If it was a particularly difficult paper, or I had trouble writing it, or I simply had trouble writing, and I did, I was a terrible writer initially, I would add a third draft. But if you don't plan it out this way, you're going to be perpetually late and it will never be your best work. I do the same thing when I have a lot of reading. So, for example, let's say that I have a book or an assignment and I've got to read 200 pages and then I've got 10 days to do it. My goal will be to read 20 pages per day. And since I know how quickly I read, especially if I'm going to be taking notes, I read somewhere between 5 and 7 pages per hour. Then I'm going to set 3 hours to do the reading. I will not do 3 hours in one shot. I will likely do one in the morning, one toward middle day, and one in the evening. I have found, and again, this is something you'll have to learn for yourself, that the time that I am not reading is really critical because it's the time when I sort it out in my head. So I'll give you an example. The other day, I'm reading material on eugenics. And one of the arguments consistently made by these people revolves around a concept called race suicide. And race suicide essentially says that if Northern European whites don't start having more kids, people of color and degenerate poor whites and white Southern European people will expand in number so quickly that one day the Northern European white will turn around and be subservient to the people of color and to the poor whites of Southern Europe and elsewhere. And aside from the fact that this is a deeply troubling idea, it was a day in which I had set out 3 hours of reading time for myself. I discovered between the first and the second hour that this flies in the face of survival of the fittest. If in fact survival of the fittest worked, then race suicide would not be a possibility. So what did I do when I discovered that? I went right to my journal and I wrote that down. For me, this is why I'm digital. I never know where I'm going to be, but I know that I can always get to my journal. And even if I have to voice dictate, I can do that. I can come back to it later and clear it up. So if I were an undergraduate or a graduate student and I was looking for a topic for a paper, I just found it. And I did it because of my disciplined approach to doing my work. I'll show you my book, but from around mid-May until 2 days ago, I wrote 130 pages. And we're talking about some intense stuff. Okay, you should be able to see it. This is it. And you can see what the footnotes look like. If you think about writing 130 pages in less than 3 months' time, that's quite an accomplishment. But the only way I am able to do it is because I keep myself disciplined and focused about my work. I'm not showing you this to tell you how good I am. I'm showing you this to give you a sense of what you can do when you become disciplined. I've told the story before. I'll tell it to you again because I think it's an important part of learning to learn and learning how to study. When I was at Yale, I was working in a factory as a toolmaker's apprentice. I got to the factory at 6. In the morning, I left to go to Yale, which was about 20 minutes away. When I was done in class, I went back to work in the factory. I usually worked until 6 o'clock at night. I had to be prepared for Yale. I was there on scholarship. I couldn't afford to go without the scholarship. I had 2 kids, married and a mortgage. So in a class called Comparative Doctrine, I got 3 D minuses in a row, and I decided to confront the professor and ask him how this could possibly be happening. Because essentially I'd been a straight A student ever since I got to Fordham University as an undergrad. And he listened very patiently, and then he said to me, you know, Falcon, everywhere you've gone your entire life, you've been one of a handful of very bright people. In case you haven't noticed, this is Yale. What matters here is not how bright you are. What matters is how determined, disciplined, and focused you are. We ended up becoming friends. He was on my dissertation committee. His name was George Lindbeck, and I ended up getting an A in the class. I ended up graduating 4th in my class at Yale. Because Lindbeck was right. Determination, discipline, focus. That's what it takes. And those are not skills that come naturally. They're skills we have to cultivate. Are there questions so far before we go on? We've got about 15 minutes left, a little bit more. Again, is this helpful? Is it making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to Foxit. And I want to go back to, I think it's Lower Than Angels. No, actually it might be here. Go to the end of that paragraph or chapter. Here you can see I put a red check next to that paragraph to further help it stand out. Anytime an author goes out of his way to mention someone, if you don't know who that person is, it's time for you to find out. Henrik Heinz was particularly important. William Heschel, important to his argument. And let's go down to the page view. One of the things that I like to do is to use notes extensively. Notice this is the chapter that's, I think, the most important of the entire book on knowledge and certainty. I love to be able to use notes wherever they're important. So, for example, under comments, I have the ability to either type directly on the PDF, which I've done, or I have the ability to insert a note directly into the text. So, for example, he mentions Oliver Cromwell. I can make myself a note and this will be saved. So anytime I come back, I can either add to this, I can go to Wikipedia and put some information about his life if I need to. But the best part for me is that I can do Control-A, Control-C. I'm a Windows person. And now I can move that directly into my journal. That can become part of a paper. It can become a footnote. And I can do the same thing here. If I switch to the hand tool and I want to brainstorm, I use Microsoft Whiteboard a lot for that purpose. Come on, we can do this. There we go. I can take this and highlight it, and then I can go to Microsoft Whiteboard where I do a lot of my brainstorming. And I just go Control-V, and then I can move it wherever I want. And work on it. I try to integrate everything I do. I try to make everything seamless. I try to spend as little time reinventing the wheel every time that I need to work. Okay, before I begin to sum up, I'm going to stop briefly. Has this been helpful? Do you have questions? Is this making sense? Is there anything you want me to go over more deeply?
I was going to bring up some of the things that still throw me off that I don't think were covered yet, is how to read works of fiction that still comment on what we're learning, and additionally, how to structure our notes when we're doing a live lecture. I can get a little bit confused in the middle of a lecture. I don't really mind. I don't know how much of our reading is works of fiction. I went too far ahead.
Okay. Let's talk about reading first. Some of it we've kind of looked at. Oops. Always read. If you're a pen and pencil person, with pen and paper. Always use a highlighter. Always summarize in your head what you read. If you can't do it in your head, or if you prefer, put it in your journal. It should be clear right now that there is always a reason. I don't assign anything arbitrarily. So ask yourself, why did Falcon assign this? What's the point? How is he going to bring this together? Because there will be a way I will bring it together. Make sense? Basically, my approach to teaching is that I am not an interpreter, which is to say, I don't vomit back to you. I expect you to read and internalize. Because I use the Socratic method. When I start a lecture, I know what I will cover. I have those points in my head. I don't know how I'm going to cover it. Sorry, how. This part comes from my dialogue with you. Am I making sense? So if you've asked yourself, what's the connection here? What is he trying to say? How does this work? What's the point? Then that should frame how you're going to read the text together. Or you can simply ask yourself, what is the theme that binds all of these readings together? That applies also to how you take the quiz. General comments. Learn the teaching style of your professor. That will tell you what's important. That will help you understand what he or she is going to look for. Secondly, once you learn that teaching style, you can ask yourself, in terms of tests and quizzes, what is he or she looking for? What does he or she consider important? Analyze. For example, there are 3 types of questions that you're going to find on my quizzes. From the book, from notes in class, and questions that are going to make you think, because I need to know if you're internalizing the material. You have 1.5 minutes, roughly, per quiz question. I would get these out of the way first, and I would save as much time as possible for these, because the thinking questions are intentionally ambiguous. In addition, you know, I've got a couple of students who sit in class and they look at me and the basic attitude is, I don't care, I don't want to be here, I'm not interested, this is torture. You know, it may be. I promise you, I try really hard to make every day interesting. I get that I'm weird as hell. Oh well. But part of the problem is that if we run into a situation, for example, and every semester there is one, where you finish with a 59.7, your not caring is not going to help your grade. Even if I haven't figured out that you don't care. If you don't invest in learning, you're not going to do well. So, if you care and you have a problem, what should you do? Don't wait till the end. That's absolute suicide. Stay in contact with the professor. Where are the issues? How can you get help? How can the professor help you? Most professors care. I've heard stories about those who don't. I can't speak to that. But I would hope that by now you've figured out that I care deeply. A professor who cares is going to do everything he or she can to possibly help you, especially in the middle of the pandemic. When you contact a professor, be clear. What is it you want? What is it you need? And please take responsibility. You know, if you come to a professor and you say, look, I made a terrible mistake. I somehow missed the announcement for the quiz. I own that. I take responsibility for that. That's going to go a lot farther than going up to the professor, and I've had this happen, and saying, you're a terrible teacher, it's all your fault, you're never clear. You owe me a retake on my quiz. That's not going to get you very far. So part of what I'm saying is, you have to invest in your education, and your professors will help nurture that investment. But singularly, because of the nature of American education these days, what's missing is the structure and the discipline. And I'm hoping that what we're talking about today is going to help with that. But Jerry, you had another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any tips for organizing note-taking or understanding during an actual lecture, because I've
Yep.
often found, like, in the middle of a lecture, I don't fully understand how what we're talking about at that moment connects to the bigger picture of what we're going through that day.
Okay, the most important thing you can do, Jerry, is to ask questions, specifically, how does this relate? I'm not offended if you ask that. In fact, I would really like it if you do. The downside of the Socratic method is that sometimes we can walk away from where we need to be. I would do it this way, and this is the way that I did it. I started every week a new section in every class. Whatever the topic was for that week was at the top of my notes. Number two, I listened specifically for a kind of thesis statement at the beginning of class by the professor. Three, I kept asking myself, how does the conversation relate to what we're supposed to be talking about? Four, if I got lost, ask for directions. Because it's my responsibility to be able to summarize where we are and where we're going. Does that make sense? Jerry?
Yeah, it makes sense so far.
Okay. Also, I would strongly urge you at the end of every class, I had a couple of professors at Yale who were absolutely off the wall, and they used the Socratic style as well of teaching, and we could end up light years from where we started. At the end of every day when I reviewed my notes, I added a summary. Not very much, 4 or 5 lines, 3 or 4 sentences or so. If I couldn't do that, I went to the professor and said, I think I missed something here. Help me wrap my head around it. That usually was sufficient to make sense out of what happened. I think part of the problem that we're dealing with is because students are so accustomed to being educated, if that's what you want to call it, only by PowerPoint, that when they encounter somebody who doesn't use PowerPoint, there's not a lot of ways to make sense out of it. Typically, what I also try to do, Jerry, is so yesterday, for example, I started out in one of my classes by drawing a distinction between Aristotle and Nietzsche. I attacked Aristotle, or laid out Aristotle's argument first. I did the same for Nietzsche, and I did so as in 1A, B, C, 2A, B, C. I would try to keep that flow going. I would reproduce the numbers that I'm using on the board. And typically, if you look at my notes from when I was a student, it's rigidly outlined. 1A, B, 1, 2, 3. Even if the professor didn't do it, I did it. And at the end of the class, if this was Roman numeral 5, there was my summary. As a consequence of that, I kept everything straight. So I would always try to outline whatever's happening in class. Make sense?
I think
Yeah.
so. I think it's I can definitely see the theory and how this would work for note taking. I think it's still a little bit of a struggle trying to figure out how to outline it while you're going through the lecture itself.
Okay. I will make a more concerted effort to try to keep my points clear. If you'll promise me that you'll ask where we're going or ask for clarification along the way. Can you do that for me?
Yeah, I'll try to speak up more in class with that.
Yeah, I think you have a lot to offer, and I would like to see you more engaged. Okay, any other questions? Kayla, Aylin, Walter, whoever else is still here?
Would now be the time to ask about more specific quiz questions, or should I save that for a little bit later?
Well, if they're specifically about quiz questions for a class, I'd rather we do that at another time after this is over.
Okay.
If you want to talk about strategy of answering questions, we can do that.
Yeah, well, my question, I guess it's not specifically about a quiz question. It's more so about, it's kind of like the question I asked earlier, like about like efficient cause versus final cause. Yeah, so my question was, I thought the efficient cause was more like the thing that like drives the making of something. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and then the final cause is like the purpose for why it was made.
Uh-huh, that's correct.
Yeah, but oh wait, sorry. I'll ask you about it because it was like a quiz question that I was confused about with like one of the answers.
You can also email me the question and I'll take a look at it. That'll work as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Walter, do you have any questions? Nick Braswell, you're off there in the ether. What do you guys think? Has this been helpful?
Yeah, I mean, it's just helped me get a better understanding of how to gain something from the readings because I'll just find myself like I try to do everything at one time. It's just kind of how I am. So like I'll sit down and just go through readings and not gain any information and just come to the quiz and be like, I don't remember anything from what I just read. So for me, it's more about like actually reading for understanding rather than like just looking at words on a page.
Yeah. Unfortunately, again, the way that people are educated these days, there's no attempt to teach them how to engage particularly complex material. And I promise you, if you're just going to sit down and read a page of Joseph Campbell, it's not going to stick. To go back to Kayla a little bit and talk about strategy for answering questions. If I sit down to take a test and I come across a question that's particularly difficult, especially when it's multiple choice, I start by eliminating any obviously wrong answers. In part, this is a matter of observation over time as well. What do I mean by that? I mean, technically, it's not very often that that's going to be the right answer. It's not very often that that's going to be the right answer. And sometimes, if it's really close, it comes down to most likely. But again, when you're taking it, you also have to learn to allocate the time correctly. So now you know there are 3 different types of questions. Get rid of the first 2 and focus on the third. I'm not alone in that strategy. I'm sure other professors do as well. So it comes back to the comment I made about learning the teaching style and the test giving style of your professor. that will help you a lot. It's also important if you can allocate your time to spend some time at the end trying to go back over it. About 15% of the time, some of my students seem to fail to answer all the questions. If you're unsure, pick one, anyone. It's better than leaving it blank. If you're given to pre-test anxiety, then by all means, I would go through the process of calming yourself down. Because if you attempt to take that test while your anxiety is peaked, you're going to crash. Not going to help you. It keeps coming down to the same repeatable patterns of behavior developed over time. Doing the work in small chunks, understanding how you learn. What works for me most of the time may not work for you. I'm not going to tell you it always does. For example, the whole thing about eugenics is such a spider web. I've buried myself so deeply into it that I'm behind finishing the chapter on eugenics. At some point, I have to decide, how much do I really need to know? Do I really have to check every source? Or can that be something that's done later, if need be? But I have an intense passion for detail. I have to learn how to check that, or I'll never finish anything. I can also be intensely distracting. If I don't get a grip on my distractibility, I'm never going to finish anything. Is this helpful? Questions?
Yes.
Okay. Is this worth repeating for other students? Is this worth doing again later in the semester as we move along? Kind of a checkup or check-in?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. We will do that. One of the biggest frustrations for me as a professor is I'm required to have office hours, and I rarely, if ever, hear from a student. I really do care. I really do want my students to succeed. I want to be as supportive as I possibly can. But it's a two-way street. If you don't reach out to me, I can't reach out to you. On that note, I want to thank you for coming. I will, sometime in the next few days, publish this. I will send you all a download link. I apparently also have to send out an email reminding everybody that I'm not going to tell you that there's a quiz every Friday, but there is. I will tell you when there isn't. This has been a particularly chaotic semester. So thank you. And for those of you I've never seen, I hope someday to actually meet you in person. And have a great day, guys. Thanks.
Actually, I do want to say something really quick. I have to comment on this. I really like the way you were doing note-taking today, basically just scrolling down the whiteboard instead of clearing it every time. I would really love to see that in class because it gives the opportunity to scroll back into what you've done previously to help try to tie things together.
I will do that. Thank you. That's very important. I appreciate that. Anyone else?
I tried reaching you through email, but I want to make sure I have the correct email.
All right.
So what is your
Write it
email
down
again?
for you. There are two email addresses that you can use depending on your browser. The actual one is this. You can also use this one. Either of those will get me.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys. Hope to see you soon.
Have a good day.
You as well.
Thank you.
If you want to contact us, we can be reached at NyghtFalcon.com or our magazine site, nightvision.com. And if you want to email me directly, you can reach me at inspiration@NyghtFalcon.com.